this for a while.
You're going to be swaying. Well, I will be neither as brief nor articulate as the chairman. So thanks, Senator Peterson. You know, the YRs mean a great deal to me for two reasons. I get a little nostalgic when I come to a young Republican event. First of all, because I used to be a Republican. Secondly, because I used to be young. I'd like to especially thank Chairman Peel for inviting me. I know it came at some cost to him with his cred with people right here in this room, but you know, outgoing presidents will oftentimes pardon a series of convicted felons on their last day. Outgoing chairman of the Young Republicans invite renegade libertarians to come speak at the convention. So when Jeff sent his invitation, I think it was in late March, and I had to look really closely because I thought this has to be some kind of April Fool's joke. But yeah, I know that even after he extended the invitation, that there was some reconsideration. The executive committee had to come back together like the UN Security Council in the face of international crisis. But I appreciate, I don't know who the executive committee is, but I very much appreciate them affirming Jeff's decision. What I hope you hear tonight is a conversation that's respectful and thoughtful and thought-provoking for you, because that's truly how I mean it tonight. I have, you know, frankly, one of the most unenviable tasks in politics, and I'm not talking about coming into a group of young Republicans and telling them that their party's in mortal danger. I'm talking about being the last obstacle between some young Republicans and some serious Tanqueray and time. You know, I look around the audience here, I see some friendly faces and some not so friendly faces. But what I do see is a group of inquisitive, intelligent, and thoughtful people, and I want to commend you all for your participation in the political process. I think some of you may have seen that the GOP Minnesota builders today said that this would be a marijuana-induced diatribe. I pledge that it will not be that. I know by inviting me tonight, I'm kind of the skunk at the garden party, and I didn't come here tonight to tell you pretty things and to tickle your ears or things that will make you feel good, but I do come as a friend, so let me explain what I mean by that. A number of years ago, I was contemplating a career in the ministry, and so in preparation for that, I had occasion to give a message at a few funerals, several weddings, and even a few weekend services. And what I would always do in preparation for that is I would share a passage of scripture that I would use kind of for the basis of my talk. So I'm going to do that again tonight. In the book of Proverbs, King Solomon said that the wounds of a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses. And the implication there is that a friend will oftentimes tell you what maybe you don't want to hear, but what you need to hear. Whereas an enemy will tell you everything's just fine, everything's going to be just okay, to lull you into a sense of apathy. So my topic again tonight, why I am no longer a Republican, but the subtitle again, how I could be persuaded to be one again. I wanted to just tell you a little bit about my Republican bona fides so you don't think I'm just some raging leftist that came to talk to you tonight. So I grew up in the 80s. I'm a child of Reagan. I grew up in the time when nuclear war seemed like the most frightening issue. It was over all of our heads. As I look around the room, there's only a few people I think who can even remember what that was like. But I was very afraid of nuclear war as a child, or as a young person in any case. And I came to think that, boy, that nuclear freeze movement, that makes a lot of sense. We need to get rid of all the nukes. Fortunately, I had an older friend who was actually an associate pastor at my church. He gave me a book called Clear and Present Dangers, A Conservative View of American Government by M. Stanton Evans. And the book really changed my life. It changed my outlook on war and peace, how we best avoid war, and it really changed my view on the role of government from the prevailing orthodoxy at that time. In my senior year in high school, I became chairman of the Washburn County, Wisconsin Young Republicans. I went to St. Olaf. Any oldies here tonight? No oldies. There were Johnnies and Toms, no oldies. But when I was at St. Olaf, I had a weekly column in the Manitou Messenger, which was the weekly student paper, a conservative column called No Left Turns. It earned me lots of letters to the editor from both students and faculty, and even the occasional death threat. And that's a good barometer that you're doing something right when you start getting death threats. My senior year in college, I became chairman of the College Republicans, so I was sold out for this party, and have been for much of my life. Right out of school, I was hired as the first full-time employee of Center of the American Experiment, which is Minnesota's conservative think tank. I worked for Mitch for about 3 years there. And then I came to a terrible realization, and that was that I wasn't going to be able to pay the mortgage on a political salary. So for most of the last 2 decades, I've spent selling technology solutions, mostly software. Even though I stepped away from politics as my vocation, it remained my avocation. So in late 2004, I started a political blog called, at that time, Dayton versus Kennedy. We were anticipating a contest between then Senator Mark Dayton and Congressman Mark Kennedy. And even though looking back, Congressman Kennedy was routed that fall, at the time it seemed like that was the most likely Republican pickup that year. So it was my intent to chronicle that race from a Republican perspective. We got a good deal of national recognition that year. We were routinely mentioned on Hugh Hewitt's nationally syndicated talk show. Was mentioned in the Wall Street Journal, National Journal. I got interviewed when I was on vacation in Mexico from the New Republic. It was a lot of fun. We had a great time. Daily Kos, of course, called us part of the right-wing lie machine, which was that was a great day. And I was told that Karl Rove was a regular reader, which is something that he later confirmed to me in person. So I stepped away from politics for a few years after the disappointment of 2006, but in 2009, I started a draft Laura Broad for governor movement. That obviously didn't go so well. So in 2010, at my district convention, I delivered a uniform slate of delegates to the state convention for Tom Emma. And then in 2008, going back a few years, I live in Minneapolis, so I have to adopt a congressional district, a Senate district, a House district if I'm going to have any impact whatsoever. So I teamed up with my friend John Swan, who is from Edina, and together we got rid of 2 of the override 6, is that what we called them at the time? And they were Neil Peterson and Ron Earhart, the latter of which we succeeded in delivering the endorsement to a fellow you may have heard of by the name of Keith Downing. So by now you're asking, when did this guy become unhinged and become one of these crazy liberty types? Well, after the disappointment of 2006, I kind of slowly turned my activism, my electronic activism, that is, more toward this new Facebook you guys might have heard I've called Facebook. I became friends with a lot of people in the conservative movement here in Minnesota, social conservatives, neoconservatives, anti-tax types, and even some of these Paul bots, or Paul tards, as we called them at the time. Little did I know that being inclusive of those people would be my undoing. Even 3.5 years ago, I thought of libertarians as really just really messed up people that didn't know what was going on, who didn't know that the terrorists hated us for our freedom, that if we decriminalized drugs, people would be lined up around the corner to get their heroin from vending machines. And after all, didn't these libertarians know that we needed to get our prostates examined every time we got on an airplane? But over many months and dozens of social media flame wars and cocktail parties and frankly some late night agonizing, I came to the conclusion that I really was no longer a Republican. And more significantly, I realized that my party, other than some nice sounding speeches every 4 years, really wasn't a small government party. I tell this story, those of you who are biblically literate will get it, the rest of you will think I'm crazy. A funny thing happened on the way to Damascus. Lady Liberty spoke to me from above and said, "Gary, why persecutest thou me?" So reason number 1 why I'm no longer a Republican. I don't think the Republican Party even stands for small government on economic matters. That's probably the one area that, no matter what type of Republican you are, you can agree on. Small government when it comes to economics. And when I survey the scene, I don't see a party that really stands for small government. Consider, for instance, that in the last 2 presidential elections, the biggest disagreement has been whether the last dollar that I earn is going to be taxed at 35% or 38%. That's not the reason why William F. Buckley started the conservative movement 60 years ago. He didn't stand before history yelling stop over 3%. In my opinion, any party that acquiesces to a third of your income being seized is not a party of small government. And while everyone in this room, I guarantee, disdains Obamacare for what it did to our health care, to our costs, to the lack of choice in health care, if that hadn't happened, just a few years prior, President Bush and Majority Leader DeLay rammed through Medicare Part B. If Obamacare had not happened, Medicare Part B would have been the biggest expansion in the welfare state since LBJ. But we forget about that. Really, on issue after issue, the GOP has kind of acquiesced to the whole Marxist notion that history is constantly on a leftward trajectory. I don't want to spend an inordinate amount of time talking about monetary policy. I was actually very pleased to see Tom Emmer talk a little bit about money supply. That's kind of a point of that a lot of people just kind of gloss over. They don't get it. But frankly, since 1913, for the last century, the Federal Reserve has debauched the currency, which Lenin called that was the linchpin. That's what would be the ultimate undoing of the capitalist system, is debauching the currency. That's exactly what the Federal Reserve has done over the last century. We've devalued the dollar by 97%. In my adult lifetime, there's only been one quote-unquote mainstream Republican who's even talked about monetary integrity, and that was my old hero, Jack Kemp, who called for a dollar as good as gold. Since then, I don't think you've seen any Republican differ from a Democrat on monetary policy. You're aware that the national debt exceeds $17 trillion. I would concede that the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania has had a lot to do with that, but I would say over the last 200 years, certainly over the last 50 years, both the Warfare State Party and the Welfare State Party have contributed a great deal to about $17 trillion. The number two reason I'm no longer a Republican is that the Republican Party, I think, has really become the party of empire and permanent war. You know, Jeffrey gave just a magnificent defense of the importance of constitutional law, really. And frankly, if you had put a gun in my head and said, Gary, why you need to be a Republican? Why are you a Republican? That would be the reason. I share a strong affinity for Justice Scalia. I didn't go to law school, but I've always been a fan and read his opinions. But that said, when it comes to matters of foreign policy, the Republican Party has no deference from what the founders thought about original intent. Today, the U.S. claims legal power to violate the sovereignty of just about every nation on the globe, whether it's through drones, through cruise missiles, or even boots on the ground. And this is so contrary to the founding that it would appall the founders the way the Republican Party views foreign affairs today. The founders pledged their lives, their fortune, and their sacred honor to secure the blessings of liberty, not to go abroad looking for monsters to destroy. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address, proclaimed peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations, and entangling alliances toward none. But I guess if I told this room, I'd be pretty confident that the vast majority of my erstwhile Republican brethren here would probably agree that the nation needs to go abroad looking for monsters to slay, in direct contravention to what George Washington warned us about. In fact, not only does today's contemporary Republican Party go abroad looking for monsters, in the case of Iraq, it actually helped invent them. The number three reason I'm no longer a Republican. The Republican Party is totally at peace with using the power of government to enforce a particular public morality. You know, probably of all the candidates here tonight, Dave Carlson is probably the person I least agree with, and yet he made a very good point. The Republican Party today is really about enforcing a particular morality. Now, it may be a morality that you and I agree with, but it's using the power of government to enforce it. The war on drugs, I want to use the war on drugs as an example. Since the 1970s, Republicans have spearheaded the so-called war on drugs. We have 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of the world's prisoners. I believe at the start of the drug war, there were 300,000 people behind bars. Today, there's 2 million people. Regrettably, a good portion of those have been minorities who have been disproportionately incarcerated for using a substance that's organic, that's frankly less toxic than the cocktails that you all are having today and that I'll be enjoying as soon as I'm done here. It was those raging libertarians, Aquinas and Augustine, who explained that not all vices should be prohibited by the force of law. really law is insufficient to make men virtuous. And finally, we must concede that the war on drugs is unconstitutional. 100 years ago, at least the federal government had the integrity to seek the authority to prohibit alcohol. But since the 1970s, the U.S. government has been going rogue. We've been using authority and power that we do not have to prohibit behavior that we find unsavory. Just a quick word about medical marijuana. I share Senator Peterson's skepticism and frankly, disdain for the currently constituted medical marijuana bill. It prescribes a very limited number of cases in which it can be administered. But I think one of the most disconcerting things that I've seen from my former party is the deference to law enforcement over medical decisions. More than that, we saw a member of the minority party say that we needed to defer to law enforcement because medical marijuana has not been given FDA approval. Since when does the party of small government defer to the FDA on matters of public health?
Yeah.
There was I think a well-known Republican, I don't want to put Senator Peterson on the spot, but one of Senator Peterson's colleagues went on record saying, quote, "We all know this is a push for recreational use of marijuana." Oh my goodness. Do you mean to tell me that people might use a plant without the authority of their government? Plants are scary, and so is liberty. But these are not positions consistent with a party that favors small government. And lastly, on this topic, our party, or I even say our party because my heart's still here, right? Our party is on the losing end of a debate over same-sex marriage. I can tell you that as a small libertarian, I'm uncomfortable with any government involvement with marriage, whether it's heterosexual or the homosexual variety. I need you guys to keep a secret here. Can you do that for me? If this gets out of this room, I'm not going to get invited to all the libertarian cocktail parties going forward. But I'm actually one of those crazy Christians who believes that marriage was designed by God for one man and one woman to reflect the relationship between Christ and the church. Even though I believe that, I am not prepared to use the power of government to enforce my particular doctrinal beliefs. And I think that should be that should be the position of a party of liberty and small government. We ought not to lie awake at night worried that our fellow Americans are choosing to seek their own happiness in a way different than what we might. The number four reason I'm no longer a Republican is that the party has really spearheaded the erosion of civil liberties since 9/11 in particular. Consider the Patriot Act for a minute. What a terribly misnamed law, frankly. Then Republican Attorney General John Ashcroft said about critics of the act, "To those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty, my message is this: your tactics only aid terrorists." That's the 21st century version of love it or leave it. And frankly, the Republican Party shamefully in the 2002 elections used the Patriot Act as a club to beat Democrats over the head, some of whom were raising very legitimate concerns about the Patriot Act. And that's really to our shame. The Patriot Act was sold as an anti-terrorism measure, but really it's been an act that's been more about surveilling Americans rather than foreign suspected terrorists. And in the entire debate about the Patriot Act, and since 9/11, and all the surveillance methods that have been put into place, no one has ever made a compelling case that the Patriot Act would have prohibited 9/11 had that law been in place prior to that terrible day. So by now you're saying to yourself, well, what are the chances this guy actually becomes a Republican? I think most of you are probably saying, hell, I don't even want this guy to be a Republican. But I will give you just a handful of reasons under which I could be compelled to join the party again and call the GOP my home. First of all, the GOP would have to get very serious about being a party of economic liberty. We talked about this earlier, but when a government or a political party is comfortable with a third of a person's income being confiscated, that's not a party of small government, nor of liberty. Bastiat famously called government the great fiction through which everybody endeavors to live at the expense of everyone else. Are Republicans better? Sure they are. But we even choose the instances in which we want to redistribute wealth. Senator Peterson made reference to the Viking Stadium. You know, there were far too many Republicans who climbed on board the Viking Stadium. You know, and frankly, that was a way of rewarding our constituents, right? The people that we like. That's white, suburban, upper middle class people who can afford to go to football games at the expense of everyone else. The second instance in which I could be persuaded to rejoin the Republican Party is if it became genuinely a party of small R Republican principles rather than a party of empire. Again, for the better part of a century, it's been orthodoxy that the United States should go abroad and install democracies, quote unquote, wherever we can, in direct contravention to what the founders wanted. If the Republican Party is to be true to its name, we really have to step back from all the entangling alliances that we have. Think, for instance, of the NATO alliance, which was designed as a way for the free countries of the West to stand against Soviet communism. Well, here we are more than a quarter century after the demise of Soviet communism, and we are still obligated to come to the defense, to go to war, frankly, if any one of 27 member nations is attacked. It's so profoundly contrary to what the founders had in mind. Third, the Republican Party must quit its preoccupation with how other people live their lives in the sanctity of their own home. You know, I believe marriage is a sacred institution, but neither God nor my beliefs are jeopardized if some other people want to pursue their happiness in a different way. You're a social conservative? Me too. That means that my job is to live in a way that Scripture and my conscience tells me to live, but without imposing those beliefs on other people. Marijuana isn't your intoxicant of choice? Me either. Mostly. But the evidence tells me that it's less toxic to my body than the drinks that we'll all be having. Moreover, my gin can't treat glaucoma, inhibit the growth of tumors, control epileptic seizures, or slow the progression of Alzheimer's. If the GOP really wants to be a party of small government, it must be okay with the myriad of individual choices that free people make in a free society. And lastly, and I'll conclude on this, the Republican Party must follow the lead of some leaders. Now, there's some obvious national leaders that come to mind for me. I know Liberty, Minnesota is going to be bringing in Representative Justin Amash in a month or so. Is that right? Certainly, he's a shining star of liberty. Probably no member of Congress has done more to make sure that our civil liberties remain intact in some sense. I think Senator Rand Paul will be a favorite of mine. I think if the Republican Party is going to have any future north of the Mason-Dixon line, it's going to require someone who can speak to minorities and young people and really preach the gospel of liberty, which I think he does as well or better than most people. But the good news tonight, my friends, is that we don't have to look just to Washington to find examples of that. And while he's been lauded enough tonight already, I want to single out Senator Brendan Peterson as a model for the future of what the Republican Party can and should be. Senator Peterson has proven himself to be a model both on transparency as well as on liberty. I hope you follow him on social media because no member of the Minnesota legislature, or I can expect, or probably in the upper Midwest, goes to as great a length to explain the thought process that he goes through before he votes on a bill, one way or another. I don't always agree with him. I'm not with him on national popular vote. We've disagreed about that. But you know what? He'll tell me exactly why he believes in national popular vote with a level of transparency that's really unheard of. Senator Peterson uses 6 criteria, which I think would be appropriate not only for Minnesota legislators, but for Republican candidates nationwide to follow. Here's the criteria he uses. Number 1, is it constitutional? How many laws would be passed if that was the first criteria that legislators used? Is it constitutional? Well, that would stop about 98% of all laws from coming on the books if people considered that. Number 2, does it expand individual freedom? Number 3, does it reduce or expand the role of government? Number 4, does it enhance decision-making at the level of government closest to the people? Number 5, does it make government more user-friendly? And number 6, does it send a pro-liberty message? In less than 4 years in the legislature, Senator Peterson has authored bills to outlaw indefinite detention under NDAA. He's required search warrants for drone surveillance. He's authored constitutional carry legislation, as well as medical cannabis legislation that is much more liberty and patient-centric than the monstrosity that the legislature is currently considering. And just this week, the Minnesota Senate overwhelmingly passed Senator Peterson's bill requiring a tracking warrant and establishment of probable cause before law enforcement or any government agencies can track your movement or location. The bill passed 63-1. He deserves our applause for that. So I say to you, my friends, that there is a way forward for your party. It's a way that's both politically popular and liberty-centric. And I can promise you that if there were more elected officials and party officials like Brandon Peterson, I wouldn't be standing before you today as a former Republican, but as a current Republican. So my charge to you is to go make a party that loves liberty and bring me back here. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. Really, I don't know how to respond to that. I appreciate it. Did we have questions that